December 1940. Europe was on fire, and Britain was standing in the flames. Winter had wrapped the island in darkness and ice, and with every passing night, the future of the Western world looked shakier. The Battle of Britain had been won up in the sky, but on the ground, the war was far from over. German bombers came back again and again. London burned. Coventry and Liverpool were smashed. Factories, rail yards, and docks took hit after hit. The Blitz wasn't just about breaking buildings, it was about breaking will. On a world map, the British Empire still looked massive. Pink stretched across continents Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean, a quarter of the globe under one flag. To the outside world, Britain still looked like a heavyweight. Inside Whitehall, everyone knew the truth. The empire wasn't just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding money, and fast. War rooms deep underground buzzed with bad news. Every bomb dropped on Britain cost steel, fuel, labor, and time. Every convoy lost in the Atlantic meant fewer machines, fewer bullets, fewer meals. This wasn't a war of flags and speeches anymore. It was a war of factories, shipping lanes, oil drums, and bank accounts. And Britain's account was almost empty. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. By late 1940, he wasn't just fighting Hitler, he was fighting the clock. Sitting in the underground cabinet war rooms, Churchill drafted one of the most painful letters of his life, not to an ally at war, but to a country still officially neutral. The letter was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Churchill was a master with words. He could turn language into a weapon. But this letter wasn't a rallying cry. It was a confession. Britain, the empire that had ruled the seas, bankrolled the world, and crushed Napoleon, was broke, flat broke. The letter laid out the situation in cold detail. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Aircraft losses were mounting. Destroyers were desperately needed to keep the Atlantic lifeline open. And then came the hard truth. Britain was running out of cash. Soon, the Treasury wouldn't be able to pay for American weapons anymore. Britain could fight on the beaches, fight in the streets, but you can't fight tanks with speeches or planes with courage alone. Ammo costs money, steel costs money, fuel costs money, and Britain had almost none left. To understand how the richest empire in history ended up begging, you have to understand how this war was different. World War II wasn't fought with horses and rifles. It was fought with machines, mountains of machines, ships, planes, tanks, trucks, each one chewing through resources at a pace nobody had planned for. Britain had one huge weakness. It had to import almost everything: food, oil, aluminum, rubber, steel. When Europe fell under Nazi control, Britain was cut off from its neighbors. The island survived only by looking west across the Atlantic to the United States. But America wasn't in the war yet. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European bloodbath. They remembered World War I. They remembered crosses in foreign soil. Congress passed neutrality laws designed to keep the U.S. out at all costs. Those laws allowed one loophole: cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons, but only if it paid cash up front and shipped everything itself. No loans, no credit, no sympathy. Gold on the table before the crates moved. So Britain paid, and paid, and paid again. Gold reserves were drained. Overseas investments were sold off. In a secret mission called Operation Fish, Britain packed up nearly all its gold and shipped it across the Atlantic to Canada. Billions in wealth sent into exile just to keep the war going. By late 1940, the vaults were empty. British officials in Washington stared at contracts they couldn't sign. There were planes and tanks ready to be built, but no dollars left to pay for them. Roosevelt understood what was coming. If Britain fell, America would stand alone. But he couldn't just hand over money. The law wouldn't allow it. The voters wouldn't accept it. So Roosevelt got creative. He sold the idea of lend-lease. To the public, he explained it like this: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't argue over the price of a hose. You lend it to him and get it back later. Simple, friendly, American. Behind closed doors, it wasn't friendly at all. It was business. Hard, cold, unforgiving business. And Britain was about to learn that survival came with a price. Lend-lease sounded generous on the surface. Behind the scenes, it was ruthless. Once the idea moved from speeches to paperwork, Britain ran headfirst into the reality of American power. Helping Britain beat Hitler was one thing, protecting the American taxpayer was another, and Washington wasn't about to blur that line. The man holding the keys was U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau hated fascism. He wanted Britain to survive. But he was also laser-focused on one thing: making sure the United States didn't get played. Before America handed over a single dollar's worth of weapons, he wanted proof that Britain had already burned through everything it owned, and he meant everything. Morgenthau demanded a full financial strip-down of the British Empire. Not estimates, not summaries. Full disclosure: every government asset, every overseas investment, every factory, mine, railway, bank account, and shipping company, whether owned by the British state or private British citizens. Nothing was off limits. British negotiators were stunned. Led by Sir Frederick Phillips, they weren't being treated like allies fighting a shared enemy. They were being treated like a bankrupt company in receivership. The message was clear: open your books, or the deal dies. Phillips tried to push back. Britain had already sold its gold. Selling long-term investments in the middle of a war would mean fire sale prices, pennies on the dollar. Worse, it would gut Britain's post-war economy, leaving the country unable to rebuild or even feed itself once the fighting stopped. Morgenthau didn't budge. If Britain still owned valuable assets in America, why should an Iowa farmer pay for British tanks? Why should U.S. taxpayers foot the bill while British elites held profitable factories overseas? That logic had consequences. The most painful example came with American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose wasn't just another company, it was a monster. The largest producer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. Hugely profitable, strategically important, and crucially, to Britain, it was a golden goose. Millions of dollars in profits flowed back to London every year, helping offset the brutal cost of imports. To Morgenthau, it was leverage. He told the British flat out, sell it. The cash from the sale would go straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. Britain resisted hard. Everyone knew the company was worth over $100 million. Selling it quickly during wartime would be financial suicide. Morgenthau held all the cards. Isolationists in Congress were attacking lend-lease, claiming Britain was secretly wealthy and manipulating America. Morgenthau needed proof Britain was bleeding. He gave London an ultimatum: sell American Viscose, lend-lease dies in committee. On March 15, 1941, under crushing pressure, Britain caved. Using emergency war powers, the British government seized American Viscose from its owners. No negotiation, no delay. American investment banks handled the sale, and they smelled blood. Knowing Britain had no choice, they drove the price straight into the ground. The company sold for about $54 million. It was robbery, worth at least double that, maybe more. Britain reimbursed the owners back home in pounds, adding to its own debt, while the U.S. Treasury pocketed the dollars to pay for guns and engines. That sale changed everything. British elites finally understood the deal. This wasn't partnership. This was extraction. The United States wasn't conquering the British Empire with soldiers, it was dismantling it with contracts. And it didn't stop there. While bankers argued over balance sheets, another trade was being cut, this one involving the Royal Navy. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for destroyers, anything that could keep supply lines alive. Roosevelt agreed, but nothing was free. In exchange for 50 aging World War I era destroyers, obsolete ships, the U.S. Navy barely wanted America, demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic: Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana. Britain handed over the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Strategic positions Britain had built over centuries were traded away for rusting ships just to survive another month. By the time Lend-Lease became law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped to the bone. Gold gone. Assets sold, bases leased, treasury empty. The empire was still fighting, but it was fighting on credit, and the bill was growing fast. Victory didn't bring relief. It brought the bill. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, British leaders believed almost desperately that sacrifice would be rewarded. Britain had stood alone in 1940. It had burned its empire to keep the world free. Surely, they thought, America would show generosity when peace arrived. They were wrong. By 1945, Britain was exhausted beyond measure. Its economy had been hollowed out by total war. Exports had vanished. Factories were worn to the bone. Cities lay in rubble. Food, fuel, and raw materials all had to be imported, and nearly all of it had been paid for. With lend-lease, that system wasn't charity. It was a switch, and once the war ended, the switch flipped. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The world celebrated. London erupted in joy bonfires, crowds outside Buckingham Palace, strangers hugging in the streets. The nightmare was finally over. 7 days later, the nightmare returned. In Washington, there were no parades, no sentiment. President Harry Truman signed a single order that hit Britain harder than any Luftwaffe raid. Lend-lease was terminated. Immediately, no grace period, no transition, no warning. American cargo ships, already halfway across the Atlantic, loaded with wheat, meat, tools, machinery, were ordered to turn around and sail home. The supply lines snapped overnight. Britain froze. Its economy had been reshaped entirely around wartime logistics. Without lend-lease dollars, the country was instantly bankrupt. Not soon, not eventually. Instantly. The man who saw the cliff first was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, stared at the numbers and felt dread. Britain imported half its food and nearly all its raw materials. Without American support, it couldn't pay for any of it. Rations already harsh would drop to starvation levels. Factories would shut. Unemployment would explode. Social collapse loomed. Keynes called it a financial Dunkirk. There was only one option left: beg. In September 1945, Keynes, gravely ill, exhausted, his heart already failing, sailed to Washington. He went not as a professor, not as a theorist, but as a supplicant. His argument was moral. Britain had fought alone, while America stayed neutral. Britain had bankrupted itself to save Western civilization. The United States, he argued, owed Britain justice not a loan, but a grant, $6 billion. A retroactive payment for holding the line. The Americans were unmoved. The war was over. Sympathy had a shelf life. Congress was tired of paying for Europe. Worse, Britain had just elected a Labour government, promising nationalization and social reform. Many in Washington had zero interest in funding what they saw as a socialist experiment. The response was cold. No gift, no grant, only a loan of $3.75 billion with interest on commercial terms. Keynes was crushed. He warned them plainly: break Britain financially, and you weaken the entire Western world right as the Soviet Union was rising. It didn't matter. The U.S. held all the leverage. Britain had nowhere else to go, and the loan came with strings. The most dangerous was sterling. Within 1 year, Britain would be forced to make the pound freely exchangeable for U.S. dollars. Anyone, anywhere, holding pounds could walk into a bank and cash them out. The Americans sold it as free trade. Keynes knew better. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to hold pounds they couldn't convert. That system, called the Sterling Area, protected British industry. Convertibility would blow it apart overnight. Everyone would dump pounds for dollars. And that's exactly what happened. Britain accepted the loan in July 1946. Keynes died shortly afterward, worn down by the fight. By July 15, 1947, the pound became convertible. Within weeks, the reserves hemorrhaged. Countries across the world cashed out their sterling. Hundreds of millions vanished. The loan meant to last years began evaporating in days. After just 5 weeks, Britain slammed the window shut and suspended convertibility. The humiliation was total. They had played by American rules and been crushed by them. The victory had come with a collapse. The collapse didn't stay confined to balance sheets. It reshaped the world. By early 1947, Britain faced a truth it could no longer hide. The empire that had ruled the seas for a century could barely keep the lights on. Its treasury was empty. Its industry was exhausted. Its global responsibilities had become impossible to sustain. And so, quietly, Britain began to step aside. In February 1947, a confidential telegram crossed the Atlantic. It came from London to Washington, and it carried a message of resignation. For decades, Britain had been the shield protecting Greece and Turkey from Soviet expansion. British troops, money, and political pressure had kept the Eastern Mediterranean out of Moscow's hands. Now Britain admitted it could no longer afford the task. The message was blunt. We are broke, we are withdrawing. If the West is to hold the line, you must take over. This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. Almost overnight, the United States stepped into the role Britain had just abandoned. American money replaced British subsidies. American advisors replaced British officers. The leadership of the Western world formally crossed the Atlantic. The handoff was complete. At home, the British people felt the consequences immediately. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Snow-buried cities. Coal froze in rail yards. Power stations shut down. Factories went dark. Families huddled in unheated homes, burning furniture for warmth. And in the bitter irony of peace, bread was rationed, something that had never happened even at the height of the U-boat blockade. This was the price of victory. In 1949, reality was finally acknowledged. The pound sterling was devalued from $4.86 to $2.80. Overnight, Britain became nearly a third poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports soared in price. Living standards fell. But the final bill stretched far beyond the 1940s. The Anglo-American loan was not symbolic. It was real. Every year, for 60 years, Britain made payments to the U.S. Treasury. Through boom years and recessions, through political revolutions and cultural change, the checks kept going out. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after the war ended, 61 years after victory parades filled London. That is the true cost of survival. In the modern age, total war has no winners. Germany lost and was destroyed. Britain won and was financially broken. Only one nation emerged, stronger than before. The United States. Its industry doubled. Its cities stood untouched. It held most of the world's gold, and through lend-lease, loans, and post-war agreements, it dismantled the British Empire's economic system without firing a shot. The empire wasn't conquered. It was purchased. When Winston Churchill wrote to Franklin Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved Britain from annihilation. But he also signed away its future. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no alternative. Britain emerged as a moral giant and an economic shadow of its former self. The empire didn't fall in battle. It was sold, piece by piece, to pay for doing the right thing. That is the hidden price of victory.